Episode 1, the verse that made the statues weep. It happened during the second hymn. Father Gerald had just lifted the chalice. The choir's voices were still trembling against the stained glass windows. Everything in the church was exactly as it had been for decades dustier. Flickering candlelight, the rustle of robes like whispers in God's ear. And then, Silas stood, 7 years old, small, pale, a child who hadn't spoken a single word since he was born, not even a cry when he came into the world. They said his silence was a miracle, a sign of purity. They were wrong. He opened his mouth. No one heard him at first. His voice didn't boom. It crawled, soft, ancient, carried not on the air but to it. The choir stopped singing mid-line. A woman gasped. The air felt heavier, like the chapel itself was holding its breath. And then the crucifix above the altar began to drip. Blood, at first, a single drop, then another, in a slow, steady stream from the feet of Christ down the wood, onto the marble. The congregation stared in stunned silence. And Silas kept speaking. His eyes rolled back, white as snow, his hands raised in slow, mechanical motion like a puppet being pulled by threads woven in centuries past. The words he spoke were not Latin, not Hebrew, not any language known to man, but everyone felt them. In their teeth, in their bones, in the guilt they hadn't confessed in decades. Some began to weep. One woman vomited. The bishop sitting near the front stood, trembling, and shouted. That verse stopped the child, but no one moved, because as Silas spoke, the statue of the Virgin, Mary tall, solemn, carved from Carrara marble, began to cry. Tears, real, streaming, and in that moment, every candle in the chapel went out. All at once, the only light was from the blood glinting on the crucifix. And Silas stopped. He collapsed into the pew like his strings had been cut. Eyes wide open, mouth bleeding, whispering one last line only the nearest nun could hear. That verse was not mine. I only remembered it. Episode 2, the boy who was born in silence. They say when Silas was born, the room fell silent, not like a pulse, not like reverence. It was the kind of silence that makes doctors forget how to move, that makes the air stop working. No machines beeped, no crying, no pulse. He was born blue, limp, and lifeless, his mother's final scream still hanging in the sterile air. For 3 minutes, the midwife wept, holding his body like a broken prayer. Then, Silas opened his eyes, and something impossible happened. Not a sound came from his mouth, but the crucifix on the wall above the bed shook. Just once, just enough to be noticed. And from that moment, Silas never made a sound again. Not during teething, not during nightmares, not even when he fell off the church steps and cracked his forehead at age 5. He watched the world like it had already betrayed him, and in a way, it had. Sister Mary Ann was the first to notice. She kept the orphanage records, watched over the children with stern warmth, but Silas unsettled her, not because he was cruel or strange, was obedient, gentle, polite, but because whenever she tried to pray near him, she forgot the words. Every time, even the Lord's Prayer unraveled on her tongue when Silas sat beside her. She once tried reading from the book of Psalms while it played nearby. Halfway through, her voice cracked. The page began to smudge. As if the ink were weeping, she never read aloud again. And then came the drawings. Silas never spoke Hebrew, he drew, and not like children do. No houses, no trees, no smiling suns. He drew symbols, circles inside crosses, wings burning at the tips, eyes with no irises. One drawing showed a figure kneeling in front of an altar made of bones. Above it was written, in childlike block letters, before Eden. He whispered, Sister Mary, and showed the priest. He dismissed it as nonsense. She burned the page. The next morning, the exact same drawing reappeared under her pillow, except this time, the kneeling figure was her. That night, she locked her door, and she prayed, but every word that came out of her mouth was in a language she'd never heard before. And Silas slept peacefully, clutching his pillow with stained fingertips. Episode 3, what the priest dreamed that night. Father Gerald had delivered hundreds of homilies in the chapel. He had baptized newborns, buried the faithful, forgiven murderers who could barely lift their heads from shame. He believed in grace, in order, in sacred silence. But ever since Silas spoke during Mass, Father Gerald hadn't been able to sleep, not peacefully, not without sweating through the sheets like he was dying in slow motion, because every time his eyes closed, the same dream returned. It began with the church, but it was no longer made of stone and glass. It was flesh, breathing, the walls throbbed like veins, the windows blinked, and standing at the altar was the child, Silas, but his skin was gray, his eyes were white, as if they had forgotten what to look at. He stood barefoot in a pool of blood that dripped from nowhere. When Father Gerald tried to speak, his mouth filled with dirt, and then Silas raised one hand. Slowly, deliberately, behind him, angels began to burn, wings charred, eyes gone, mouths sewn shut with strands of rosary beads. One angel twice the size of a man reached for Silas, and the boy spoke, not in words, but in vibration, in meaning, a single phrase that broke the air like glass under pressure. You should not have remembered me. The angel burst into ash. That's when Father Gerald woke up, heart slamming, sheets soaked, tongue blistered. He stumbled to the mirror in the rectory, opened his mouth. There, on the inside of his bottom lip, burned into the skin like it had been branded, were symbols, not letters, not language, but the same shapes Silas had drawn over and over. Swirls nested in thorns, a circle with 3 crosses twisting inward. He went to the chapel that morning, still shaking. He didn't look at Silas. He didn't dare. But as the boy walked past him, something happened. Silas paused, turned, and smiled, not like a child, like something watching through a child. Then he reached up and gently touched Father Gerald's hand. Just once. The burning stopped. The priest cried because for a moment, he understood. He didn't know the words, but he knew the feeling they carried. They weren't a prophecy. They were a warning, and someone, somewhere, had heard them before. Episode 4, the page that wasn't in any Bible. There are pages in every holy book that go unread. Pages torn, lost, stuck together by time and damp hands. But what Father Thomas found had never been part of any printing press. It was discovered by accident. He returned to the village after a long exile, disgraced, forgotten, called back only because no other priest dared go near Silas. They told him to observe, nothing more. But on his second night back, sleepless and weary, he wandered into the abandoned west wing of the convent library. Dust lay over everything like snow on a battlefield. Shelves cracked under the weight of forgotten faith. He pulled a worn Latin Bible from the shelf, its cover flaking like old skin. He opened it and felt something shift between the pages. Something warm. Inside, wedged between Psalms and Proverbs, was a page that didn't belong. It was made of parchment, not paper-edged, and slightly translucent. Like skin stretched thin, there were no chapter numbers, no verse numbers, just one line, centered, scrawled in a dark red ink that flaked when touched. He who speaks what was sealed shall awaken what was buried beneath the altar of light. Father Thomas didn't breathe, because as his fingers traced the strange letters, the temperature dropped. The candles behind him flickered and turned upside down in their holders, wax curling upward like it wanted to climb away from flame. He dropped the Bible, and the lights went out, but the parchment glowed, faintly, like it remembered fire. On the back of the page was a drawing, a child arm stretched wide, standing on a pulpit, but his shadow on the floor had wings and horns. Father Thomas stumbled back. The edge of the altar cut his palm. Blood dripped onto the page, and in that moment, the letters shifted. The ink rearranged itself. New words bloomed like rot. The verse was never written. It was remembered by one not meant to survive the flood. Then footsteps, tiny, there, behind him. He turned. Silas was standing at the doorway, watching. He didn't move, didn't blink, but his lips curled slightly, and Father Thomas saw, with ice in his veins, that the boy's fingertips were red, not from blood, from ink. Episode 5, those who heard it and didn't survive. It began with humming, soft, fragile, like something being remembered, not sung. The choir had gathered that Sunday like always, 12 young voices, robed in white, hands folded like folded wings. They hadn't rehearsed anything new, but halfway through Agnes Day, something changed. The girl in the second, Rolina, 13 years old, began to hum a tune none of them recognized. It wasn't dissonant, it wasn't ugly, it was wrong, like it belonged to a place where music was used to control, not comfort. One by one, the other children joined in. They didn't mean to. Their mouths just moved, eyes glazed, breath shallow, some of them crying without knowing why. The organist frowned, his fingers lifted from the keys. The sound continued. No instruments, no human control, just that haunting, circling him, spiraling upward like smoke from a burnt offering. And then Lena collapsed, blood ran from her ears. Her lips kept moving, though no sound escaped. Two others dropped to their knees, trembling violently. The smallest boy, Mateo, began whispering the melody's words no one had taught him. Before there was breath, there was sound, and the sound had no name, for names had not yet been invented, but it remembered its master. The priest shouted to stop, but the choir didn't stop until Silas stood in the back, barefoot, pale, eyes fixed not on the children but on the ceiling. The hymn ended with one note, a long, sharp hum like the file thread snapping on a violin. Then silence. Lena lay motionless. Mateo blinked, disoriented. His mouth was full of blood but no guts, and carved into the skin of the eldest boy's chest, rising through his robe like ink on paper, were words in no known tongue. When the bishop examined the children hours later, only 3 had any memory of what happened. The others remembered a field of white, a figure waiting, and a phrase burned into the sky above them. What was sung was never learned. That night, Father Tomas listened to the recording from the service. At minute 14:23, just before the collapse, he heard something. Not a voice, a whisper beneath the hymn, a whisper that sounded like a child breathing into his ear. They weren't supposed to survive remembering it. Episode 6: The nun who tried to silence the child. Sister Agnes had spent 32 years in the convent. She had witnessed deliverances, baptisms, and last breaths drawn in peace. She'd held hands with mothers as they begged for sons to come back from war, and heard confessions so dark they made her hands shake during morning mass. But she had never met a child like Silas. When she looked at him, her prayers unraveled. When she stood near him, her crucifix felt heavier, like it wanted to fall. And when he walked by her in the hall, the candles dimmed behind him. Every time she watched what it did to the choir, she saw the Versailles skin. She heard the voice on the recording that shouldn't have been there. So she made a decision. Silas wasn't a prophet. He wasn't cursed. He wasn't misunderstood. He was a mouthpiece. And if he was speaking for something buried, then she would bury it again. At midnight, she entered his room. He was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, like he'd been expecting her. His hands were folded, his eyes were open wide, staring at the floor. She didn't hesitate. She lifted the silver crucifix from her neck, kissed it once, and placed it firmly on the boy's chest. What happened next made her drop to her knees. The cross burned her, not Silasher. Her palm blistered instantly, flesh searing where it touched the metal. And the boy, he didn't flinch, didn't scream. He looked at her with something ancient behind his stare, and then he spoke, only 2 words, "Not yours." Sister Agnes backed away in terror. She turned to flee, but that door wouldn't open. The room grew darker, not in color, in weight, and from the walls, faint chanting began, low, repeating, familiar. She covered her ears, realizing too late that it was her own voice. But not now, not this moment. It was her, as a child, reciting prayers she hadn't spoken since the night she stopped believing she could be forgiven. And then the bed behind her creaked. She turned. Silas was gone, but something else was sitting in his place. Not a child, a shape-shifting, flickering, wearing a veil of light like a mask. And in its hands, her childhood diary, open to a page she had burned 20 years ago. It read, "I lied during confession. I kept the sin because part of me liked it." She collapsed. In the morning, the other nuns found her in the chapel, staring at a candle that wouldn't light. She didn't speak for 3 days. And when she did, all she said was, "I tried to silence him, but it was never him that needed silencing." Episode 7: The verse that was heard in a dream. It was never recorded, never written, never spoken aloud, but Father Tomas heard it anyway in a dream that didn't feel like his own. It began in a scorched field. The sky above him wasn't dark with light, it was raw, like skin torn back to show muscle underneath. There were no stars, no sun, only smoke rising upward from a chapel that looked almost like the one he served in, only older, like its bones had outlived God. Tomas stood barefoot, his cassock was gone, and ahead of him stood Silas, but older, taller, his eyes burned gold. He wasn't facing Tomas, he was speaking into the wind, and the words first came in fragments. The hands that shaped Eden were not the first. Before the command was spoken, another was buried beneath it. Each word he spoke cracked there. Lightning flashed in silence, not from heaven but from beneath the soil. And the wings, thousands of them, not white, not angelic, they were torn, molten, some still twitching. They rained from the sky like falling prayers that had been set on fire. Tomas screamed, but no sound came out. Then Silas turned, and it wasn't Silas. It was something wearing his boy's face, stretched across something vast and ancient, like a mask held in place by innocence. You were taught to fear the serpent. Nothing said, but you never asked who buried it. The field cracked open, a pit, endless, screaming without voices, and Tomas began to fall. He clutched his chest as rosary turned to ash in his hands, and just before the darkness swallowed him whole, a final whisper rose from the edge of the dream. This verse cannot be translated, only remembered. He woke screaming, sweat-drenched, knees weak. The bed beneath him was soaked, not just with sweat but with ink. It was seeping from his skin, from his mouth, his pillow covered in smudged symbols. He couldn't read but knew they had heard. That morning, the chapel bells rang. No one pulled the rope. Silas was already waiting in the front pew, smiling and humming the rhythm of the verse, backward. Episode 8, Silas spoke again, and the bells wouldn't stop ringing. They rang for 6 hours. Not once, not in warning, but in something, deeper recognition. At exactly 3 p.m., that chapel bell, untouched for years, began to toll. First once, then again, and then it never stopped. Not even when they cut the rope, not even when they removed the clapper, not even when they tore it from the belfry. It kept ringing from the inside, like the tower itself was remembering something that couldn't be silenced. And beneath that unholy rhythm, Silas spoke his second verse. He stood in the nave, barefoot again, his eyes rolled back into white silence. But this time, he didn't whisper, he didn't chant, he screamed. The sound that left his throat wasn't human, it was familiar in a way that made the bones beneath the altar tremble. The sound of a world before structure, before light, before forgiveness. The stained glass windows shivered, one by one. The saints depicted in colored light bled from their eyes. The Virgin cracked, St. Peter's key melted, and Judas' face long removed from the design centuries ago appeared again in the glass. Sister Colette tried to run, but slipped in what she thought was water pooling across the chapel tiles. It wasn't. It was wax, melted from candles that hadn't been lit in decades, melted upward. Meanwhile, Silas kept screaming. The verse poured from him like fire, a language with nowhere between syllables, just intention, a truth that didn't ask permission. People came from the streets, drawn to the sound, but the moment they crossed the churchyard, their reflections vanished in the chapel glass. They saw themselves blink out, and still they entered, drawn to the sound like sheep to a shepherd they'd never seen, but always felt behind their dreams. Father Tomas arrived last. The moment he stepped inside, the bell above shattered, not from volume, from release, and just then Silas stopped, mid-sentence, mid-breath. He collapsed, twitching, eyes wide open. The chapel frowned in time, except for the mirrors, all along the far wall, cracked and old. Mirrors the sisters had once used for cleaning garments now showed something no one could understand. Every person in the room except Silas was kneeling, even the ones standing. Even the dead, their reflections knew the posture before they did, and one word appeared, etched across the mirror glass in a language no hand had written. It has begun remembering itself. Episode 9, The Forbidden Translation. He arrived with books under one arm and arrogance under the other. Professor Alden Vex, linguist, atheist, a man who claimed to have read the Tower of Babel in reverse. The church didn't trust him, but they didn't know who else to call. They handed him the recordings, the symbols carved into wood, the torn parchment retrieved from beneath the altar, one that hummed faintly when held too long. And then they showed him Silas. The boy sat still, drawing in ash on the chapel floor. Alden knelt beside him, not out of reverence, but fascination. "Do you understand what you're saying, child?" he asked. Silas didn't look up. He just whispered, "No one understands it, not even him." Alden smiled. "Let's find out." For 2 days, the professor locked himself inside the convent's oldest room. He analyzed the verse syllable by syllable, broke it into stanzas, compared it against Aramaic, Sumerian, pre-Egyptian liturgical glyphs. Nothing matched, not exactly, but then something did. Not a language, a structure. The verse followed a pattern, identical to ancient command sigils it meant to describe, but to activate. These weren't words for understanding. They were instructions, and they were written for humans. At 3:16 a.m., Alden burst into the chapel, wild-eyed, bleeding from his nose, trembling. He clutched a notebook filled with scratch translations crossed out, rewritten, overwritten in red ink. They weren't meant to read this, he said. They were meant to carry it. Father Thomas stepped forward. "What does it say?" Alden didn't answer. He opened his notebook to the final page, where only one sentence remained. A phrase, translated in all capitals, letters uneven, as if his hand had fought to form them. "I speak the memory that predates the MMAND to obey." Then Alden dropped the notebook. His mouth opened, and he began to recite the verse, fluently, perfectly, like he had been born with it stitched into his lungs. The candles exploded, the mirrors shattered, the altar began to crack, and Silas watched in silence, finally smiling, because now someone else was carrying the weight of the memory, and the memory was no longer just a sound. It was becoming a voice. Episode 10, The Father Who Heard His Son Speak the Verse. His name was Jonah Rourke, a mechanic, an atheist, the kind of man who Saturday in the back pew at funerals but never bowed his head. He believed in engines, in rust, in the finality of death. He never believed in anything divine until his son died, 8 years old, fever in the brain, gone in a night. He buried the boy with no priest, no cross, just a small paper airplane tucked into the casket. His wife had already left years ago. His son was all they had, and when the casket lowered, so did his will to speak. Then came the night he heard it. He was walking past the chapel, keys jangling in his hand, when something the sound not meant for the street caught him by the throat. It was a child's voice, familiar, his son's. He stopped breathing. The voice came from inside the chapel, echoing through stone and stained glass, low and slow and reverent. Jonah stepped through the doors, heart clanging like a funeral bell in his ribs. Silas was standing alone before the altar, eyes closed, hands open, mouth moving, and what came out wasn't English, wasn't any language Jonah knew, but somehow he understood every word, because he'd heard them before just once, the night before his son died. The boy had whispered something in his sleep. Jonah thought it was nonsense, a dream. Now he was hearing the exact same verse, syllable for syllable, but Silas wasn't dreaming. He was remembering. As Jonah watched, tears erupted from his eyes. He fell to his knees, choking on breath. And then Silas opened his eyes, looked at him, and said, "Your son didn't forget you, but heaven did." Jonah collapsed, sobbing, laughing, something between grief and revelation. He crawled to the altar, where the crucifix had begun to tremble, and for the first time in 30 years, he prayed, not for forgiveness, not for his son, but for the verse to stop echoing in his bones, because now it wouldn't leave him. Later, when the nuns found him asleep on the chapel floor, his hands were covered in soot. He didn't remember writing anything, but carved into the wood beneath him, burned into the altar base like lightning had kissed it, were the same words his son once whispered in the dark. He returns not as lamb, but as memory. Episode 11, The Shadow That Knelt Beside the Altar. The bells rang at 3:33 a.m. No wind, no hand on the rope, no reason, just 12 deep tolls that rolled through the village like thunder beneath the skin. Sister Cole let Saturday bolt upright in bed, rosary clenched in her hands so tightly it left a wound. She'd heard stories bells ringing for the dead, for the damned, for the forgotten, but never for the unwritten. By the time she arrived at the chapel, the doors were already open. Candlelight flickered inside, yet no one had lit them. and at the center, just in front of the altar, something was kneeling. It was not Silas. He stood near the back pew, eyes glazed in a kind of sacred stillness, as if waiting to be forgotten. The thing beside the altar was shaped like a man, but the light bent away from it, a shadowy weight. With breaths, it knelt with its back to the congregation, spine arched in reverence or sorrow no one could tell. And every few seconds, its body trembled, like it was remembering pain too ancient for flesh. Sister Cole gasped, and the shadow turned slightly, just enough, just barely. She saw its face. It was made of light, but carved in ruin, one eye open, the other sealed shut by what looked like ash and salt. And around his throat, a rosary, pulled so tight it dug into glowing skin. The bells tolled again, and the stained glass windows, for the first time in the church's history, cracked from the inside. Silas stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as if he knew something sacred and sick was unfolding. And then, in a voice barely above a breath, he whispered, "He's not kneeling to God, he's kneeling to what came before him." Sister Cole collapsed, not from fear but from recognition. She'd seen that shape once before, in a vision she buried, a vision from the day she first took her vows, where a voice told her, the first to kneel was not the first to obey. When she looked again, the shadow was gone. Only burn marks remained on the floor, and in the air, a scent of something holy, but long dead. Episode 12, the gospel that God buried. It was never meant to be found, not by scholars, not by saints, and certainly not by a boy who had never read a word in his life, but buried beneath the chapel sill behind bricks that bled when struck. Father Thomas uncovered a box, iron, blackened, warm to the touch, etched not with a cross, but with a single symbol, a mouth sewn shut by thorns. Inside, wrapped in crumbling parchment and shrouded in a cloth that smelled of myrrh and rot, was a book, thin, hand-bound, fragile, and older than time. It didn't have a title, but when he opened it, the pages whispered, not aloud. Inside him, they whispered memories he had never lived, sins he had never committed, and one truth that erased every sermon he'd ever preached. This was not prophecy, this was recollection. The text was written in layers. Some words only appeared under candlelight, others only under silence. And on page 13, in blood-red strokes, was the verse Silas had spoken weeks before, word for word, no translation, no footnote, and above it, scrawled in hurried script, "Do not let it be spoken, do not let it be remembered, for it awakens the one who watches beneath the altar of light." Thomas dropped the book. The chapel floor groaned beneath him. Anton heard it, not in his ears, in his bones. Footsteps, coming from nowhere, yet shaking everything. The walls of the chapel began to darken, as if the light itself were being wrung out of them. The crucifix above the altar cracked down the center, splitting Christ's face in half. And Silas appeared in the doorway. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't glowing, he was trembling. Tears slid down his cheeks, but his lips moved anyway, not speaking, not chanting, reciting, as if something ancient had risen within him, demanding to be spoken aloud once more. The book flipped itself open. Pages flew, candles shattered, and a single line formed in fire across the chapel wall. What was buried was not dead, only forgotten. Father Thomas fell to his knees, and this time, he didn't pray, he begged. Episode 13, the child who spoke before time had a name. He spoke it at dawn. No audience, no priest, no candles to flicker, no crucifix left unbroken, just a ruined chapel and a silence so profound, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Silas stood barefoot before the altar, now blackened and cracked from what had risen beneath it. The air around him shimmered, not with heat, but with memory. Father Thomas watched from the doorway, hands shaking, heart already half collapsed from what he had seen in the buried gospel. He knew what was about to happen, and he knew he couldn't stop it, because what Silas was about to speak was older than language, older than prayer, older than the God the church dared to name. The child opened his mouth, and every mirror in the village shattered. Every dog howled, every clock stopped, even the birds fell silent in mid-flight. The verse came not in one tongue, but in all of them, layered atop each other like time itself had begun unraveling. Before the first lie was spoken, before Eden was formed, before sin was born into the bones of man. He watched, he remembered, and he waited to be named again. The walls trembled, the altar split, and the stained glass windows melted like sugar in May. And, behind Silas, they saw it, shadows kneeling, down scenes, hundreds, not demons, not angels, reflections of people no longer alive, those who had heard the verse before and had been forgotten by time. They weren't praying, they were listening, as if this verse at this final echoes their last tether to something sacred. Silas turned, slowly, to Father Tomas, his voice no longer that of a child. You called it a prophecy, but it was never a warning. It was a memory God refused to keep. Father Tomas wept, not out of fear, but because for the first time in his life, he felt what Adam must have felt before he was given breath. Silas collapsed, not violently, he simply faded, his body becoming light, then dust. In nothing, only his voice remained, carried by a wind that had no direction. I was not sent, I was remembered, and then a thing. The chapel fell quiet, and in the center of the altar, where the blood had dried and the stone had cracked, a new verse had been etched. In the beginning, he listened.